Welcome to Policy Talks. Outer Space is one of the flagship programs of African Union's Agenda 2063. To this end, the African Space Policy and Strategy was adopted in 2016, and the African Union Commission, as well as member states, are expected to implement the instruments. Today, we are going to look back at the year 2022 and examine different space activities that went on in the continent, both at the national and at the regional level. My guest today is Mr. Joseph Ibe, an analyst with Northern Sky Research. Mr. Joseph, welcome to Policy Talks.
Thank you, Etim. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm a big fan of the African Space Leadership Institute. I think it came at the appropriate time. It's great to have thought leadership on the continent, helping to drive some of this conversation and as well driving some of the activities across the stakeholder board.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your support. So let's start with Agenda 2063. As I mentioned earlier, one of the flagship programs is the Outer Space Program. And to this end, a couple of initiatives have been carried out. And I want us to start by looking at some of these initiatives, one after the other, starting with the African Space Policy and Strategy, which the heads of state adopted in 2016. When we look at the document, it contains several strategic actions, projects, projected outcomes, KPIs. It's a great document if you put it that way. So my first question would be: is Africa in step with the realization of the space policy and strategy?
Yeah, I think the space policy and strategy is a great start. The policy details were well articulated. I think they reflect recognition of critical areas in Africa where space can be vital in driving some of the changes on the continent. How far since the implementation or since the signing of the policy documents and the journey so far might probably be described as being delayed. I think the progress to the point of articulating the policy document is great, but the journey on the implementation so far, I think there are a few bumps along the road, and I wish those were addressed sooner than later.
Okay, we'll come to that in a minute, because one of the institutions that was established to kind of implement the policy and strategy, the African Space Agency, and we'll discuss that a bit more. But still looking at the policy document, there are four key thematic areas: that's Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning, and then space science and astronomy. Can you kind of give a sense of what is happening in these sectors, especially from the industry perspective?
From my perspective across the board, I think the grassroots impact on the space science and astronomy is growing pretty strong, with some of the effort by the African Astronomy Society, I think. And also, I think there's a whole lot of activities going on because of the Square Kilometer Array project. And we've seen that cutting across not only in South Africa, but in also I think about 13 partner countries. I don't have the actual numbers on the partner countries, but the activities on the grassroots, it's important because in other areas of space activities in Africa, we usually see a big announcement and we'll see maybe some project acquisition of satellite. But when we look at who are the key people driving this conversation and how internalized are they to the national programs, to research institutions across the continent, I think we've seen formidable efforts on the space science and astronomy journey so far, especially when you look at it from institutional and academic perspective. on the area of satellite navigation, and I think that's also a key area that is largely driven by the European African collaboration, and particularly the EGNOS project. But also, when you look at the satellite communication activity, Africa has invested heavily in acquiring communication satellite. I think from some data from Space in Africa, 99% of the investment, 99%, up to 99% of the dollar value invested in space infrastructure in Africa, excluding astronomy, goes into satellite communications. And we've seen some of those communication satellite projects. I think what I am particularly looking out for is sustainability of some of the earlier projects. We have the NICOMSAT project, we have the RASCOM SAT projects. Some of those earlier projects that promised connectivity to bridge the digital divide on the continent. It's been great they've launched the first satellite, but I'm also looking to how commercially sustainable and replacing some of the instruments that will expire over the next few years, and particularly also continuing to invest in some of those capabilities, especially now that there is competition from new constellations that have global coverage and will obviously target Africa. We're seeing them target Africa. Across the board, I think some of the projects are going well. Some have more foundational roots than the others, but others are also in a way where you expect that the African Space Agency will be able to drive that effort.
Okay, let's pick on each of them maybe further down. Like you mentioned, astronomy. One of the things that is happening next year, actually 2024, it's the IAU General Assembly. That's the General Assembly of the International Astronomical Union. And for the first time since the establishment of the IAU, Africa, specifically South Africa, will be hosting that General Assembly. And of course, like you also mentioned, the SKA, which South Africa is also hosting, is construction has actually started. So do you have a sense of, the preparation for the IAU General Assembly? Do you have any sense of what's happening in that area?
No, so I don't have any concrete information around that. I particularly cover the commercial markets, especially in the satellite communications and connectivity area. But aside from that, I think I'm particularly excited the way the SK capability is being built. It's not a top-down. Africa is involved, and we're looking for foreign funding to support this project. I think it's a unique project that has been particularly developed from capabilities locally, from the instruments, the antennas, and all that. You would see a thriving industry in this sector, particularly because of the funding that goes into SK. I think for a lot of our conversation, I might use South Africa as an example in some of this, which I think anyone that has followed the African space program knows why that is the case. I think for SK in particular, when you study the SK program, you will see capabilities that are developed and built around the program, and you'll see the projections that the dollar value mapped by the South African government into this program. A considerable amount of that would go into the South African economy, supporting providers that are developing some of the instruments for the SKA project. And when you look at that across the board, maybe in Ghana, you continue to see some of that activity coming on board as well in Ghana with institutions that are leading the effort. And I think it's the same across other partner countries. And I think it's a great effort that some of that activity is driven particularly by institutions locally.
Okay, you also talked about satellite communications connectivity, and as you are very much aware, Starlink from SpaceX of the US has already started operations in some countries in Africa, I think Nigeria and Mozambique. And I don't know, maybe a few years from now, the European Union also wants to extend the IRIS-2 project, which is the Secure Connectivity Initiative of EU, down to Africa. What will be the impact of these interventions, if I may use that word, in the African market when it comes to satellite communications and connectivity?
So from what I see I always say that connectivity, it's one of the most immediate challenges on the continent that space can solve, and space is solving already. I think in the case of Starlink is the poster child in the media in these past few days, just by the sheer amount of their branding. But when you look on the net, what is happening in the connectivity markets in Africa, we've seen companies that are building last mile connectivity on the continent. We've seen the African Mobile Network. We've seen other providers, including geo operators, that are already selling services on the continent. A lot of these services are sold by foreign operators, but we also have the local operators, the NICOMSAT, the RAXCOMSAT. I think when we look at this market from what's actually happening, what is the prospects and the economic value of this connectivity solution, I think you can sum that up in what they are targeting. So these days, we've seen announcements with the largest telecom operators in Africa that are buying satellite capacity to provide wireless backhaul in rural communities. Efforts like that continue to grow. On the consumer internet, the service that Starlink is offering, so that is still a fledgling market in Africa, just because of maybe the cost of equipment for direct consumers. But now what we've seen in the market in Nigeria and Mozambique, where Starlink has launched, I think in Nigeria, Starlink is offering equipment for $600 and monthly subscription for somewhere around $43 per month. That's in the context of the market. We receive very early economic benefits to people who are looking to work from anywhere on the continent, right? I think the connectivity need for Africa, maybe if I pull up GSMA data, I think about 28% of the population is connected, some 40-something% has mobile coverage but no connection, maybe because of poverty or some religious reasons that are not connected. And then I think you have somewhere around 17% without coverage. So that 17% is a market that satellites would help address, maybe through wireless backhaul, through enterprise networks in some areas, and through community Wi-Fi, which is a model that is growing on the continent. But at the end of the day, when you look at consumer broadband services and the addressable markets in Africa, I think they would be able to address a very unique and niche set of consumers who are now the youths working remotely from Africa in some foreign countries. I was based in Nigeria. I worked remotely with a US company for a while. If I was still in Nigeria for Starlink, I'll probably buy the service, and instead of staying in Lagos, I'll move down to my home community, where I could probably have cheaper housing and better standard of living, and while connecting and using Starlink. So that sort of market is growing in Nigeria, across the board in Africa. and it's a market that some of these consumer broadband offering would serve. But I think the critical infrastructure for connectivity on the continent would be driven by the wireless backhaul infrastructure that satellite operators are deploying on the continent. Now, we're already seeing that at scale with the partnerships with MTN, Orange, and Airtel, and other satellite operators on the continent. Then when it comes to how can Africa play on deploying this infrastructure themselves, I think the EU constellation plan includes Africa in that. And obviously, the LEO constellations will provide coverage across the continent. And I guess to your question, would Africa be able to deploy some of these themselves locally? And what does that look for the continent? I think it goes two ways. Some of these projects are capital intensive, right? I think Starlink would be investing somewhere over $10 billion. I think around $4 billion already invested in the network. Who are the providers in Africa that will be able to raise such amount of money and justify the economic business? That is a question that would be asked. I'm usually of the opinion that these are commercial endeavors and should be viewed from a commercial lens at first. And because when you look at the number of projects in Africa competing for government funding, I don't expect that you'll see a national government in Africa that would spend billions of dollars in putting up a constellation. And remember, these constellations will have to serve a global addressable market to be profitable. So I believe African countries should be able to look at it from a strategic point. How can we deploy local infrastructure? Because satellite is not the only piece of the puzzle, right? How can we deploy other infrastructure that can be able to drive some of that? Or what sort of national policies could unlock the use of satellite connectivity? So we've seen that in Brazil, where the regulators require last mile obligations for 5G auction. And now MNOs are using satellite to deploy 4G in rural areas in Brazil, even though the economic benefit is not there, but at least they get the benefit from the 5G auction obligation. So sort of those regulations and being able to support the infrastructure that can drive that. And I think things like that could really drive the connectivity market, and satellite will be instrumental to that.
Yeah, I think it's really important, as you mentioned, to the issue of having appropriate policies, because even if Starlink comes in, the issue of affordability is an issue. The Irish 2 of the European Union is still a few years down the line. The impact of present providers like Nicomsat and Rascom, well, it's still not very strong, or we don't have the visible impact. Starlink going for the equipment of Starlink going for $600. Is that affordable by typical consumers, say like in Nigeria?
So I mentioned there is a group of consumers that Starlink would target, and that group, the addressable market might be somewhere in the thousands when spread across Africa. So that is the group of affluent youth content creators, programmers that are working remotely and earn enough money in dollars or in pounds. And that group is growing across Africa. Talented, dedicated contractors or employees who work remotely from Africa. I think that is a group that would continue to make orders for some of these consumer broadband services. I think that could be affordable. But on the idea that the service will provide connectivity at scale for the unconnected. I remember I said there are 2 or 3 categories of people in Africa. The about 25% who have mobile network coverage and are connected, or I think around the other 40% who I think around 53% who have connectivity but are not connected, maybe because of poverty or religious reasons, they don't use mobile connectivity. And the last 19% who are not connected at all. So I think some of these new services will help telecom operators expand coverage in the last 19%. But the addressable market for who would buy the equipment, it's also within the people who already have coverage but are looking for something faster, something with higher throughput and all that. And that you can find within the youth affluent population growing in Africa who are providing services in the fintech, in the creator economy, and some of those booming digital economy in Africa. And I think it's more of this could drive that forward. It could, in the long term, reduce some of the congestions in the urban areas, because if you have connectivity, strong connectivity wherever you are in Nigeria, you don't have to move to Lagos, right? And I think that you will continue to see as a trend in terms of driving reducing rural to urban migration. But that's addressable market is limited. It's probably in the hundreds of thousands and not in the million yet in Africa.
That's well noted. Okay, let's now talk about the African Space Agency. After the adoption of the policy and strategy in 2016, the heads of state established the agency and adopted the statutes for the agency in 2018. The agency is expected to commence operations this year. That's been the news we've been getting. How far have we gone in that respect? Is the agency really ready to commence operations? What's going on in Egypt right now?
Yeah, so I think Egypt has been announced as a host city, and the African Space Agency building is one of the constructions ongoing in Egypt within the Egypt Space City, which is a laudable project I believe we will talk about. But on the actual launch and operationalization of the Space Agency, I think the much I know is the much available in the media. I think a lot of that effort now boils down to implementing the project proper, setting up structure, and a lot of that comes from funding. I think the last time I had updates on the project was that there's effort going on in terms of raising and funding for the project. So my expectation is that hopefully this year we'll begin to hear what the next steps are in terms of maybe beginning to put human faces to the people that will drive the effort, and what sort of commitment are they getting from African government. I think this has been said that it will be great for the African Space Agency to have a structure. I think it's going to be hard to have a structure, but it on the long term would sustain the African Space Agency to be able to develop funding mechanisms locally. So the agency would not in any way be mostly dependent on foreign donors, because that could possibly skew the interest of the agency. And I think that will be a very important way to drive that. And it's usually tough in multilateral projects, especially in Africa, where there are other projects competing for funding. But if the African Space Agency can establish that mechanism where they get commitment from African countries to be able to I think that is the plan, but hopefully that comes into fruition.
So if the agency it's going to be dependent on African countries for support, African countries that are kind of struggling with their own space programs and in terms of funding space programs. Is that, I mean, wouldn't that affect the operations of the agency? Is that model sustainable?
So that model could be sustainable in the long term. Let's look at this from a point of view. In 2022, African countries budgeted about $500 million for space programs, according to Space in Africa, right? And that number has been growing year on year over the last 5 years. So it speaks to the idea that African countries are focused on developing space capabilities and are investing, they are putting their money where they see the interest, right? And the question is, can the African Space Agency convince African policymakers that the African Space Agency is instrumental to driving some of these efforts, right? And if that is the case, how complementary can the African Space Agency be to your national space program? And sort of that dialogue, and then you can be able to say, okay, and this is also the cost with that. But when you make the African Space Agency dependent on donor agencies, that may not be sustainable, because we continue to see space becoming a geopolitical affair, especially now with the rising US, China, and European dichotomy. So when you have that sort of model, the African Space Agency would likely be placed in a position where they have to decide which of the interests of the maybe the big powers to align with. And when the interests do not align, the funding sources may not be sustainable as well. So I think it's important at the foundation. Now we continue to see investments in African space programs, over $500 million invested in 2022. That is good funding for projects in Africa. And we think that will continue to grow year on year. We think that would continue to grow as also commercial partners continue to invest in Africa. So when you look at that effort, I think is a movement the African Space Agency can tap into. And if the program is structured in a way policy makers are convinced that this is essential, I think it can thrive. And maybe funding or support or partnership, obviously with foreign players, will be necessary. But I hope that would not be the foundation, because it will be on a very shaky foundation.
Each of these African countries, they have their own priorities and programs and maybe projects. And then we are bringing in the African Space Agency. So how will the African Space Agency work side by side with the national space agencies?
So I think the African Space Agency can galvanize efforts on collaboration. So you have the national space programs at the bottom. We've seen examples of maybe bilateral, multilateral efforts for collaboration in space in Africa. We've seen the efforts in Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya on the ARM projects. We've seen Egypt now trying to do the African development projects. Sort of that level of sub-regional, bilateral, multilateral collaborations are happening. I think you can argue that one challenge for that project is also funding, right? But now that the African heads of states have approved the African Space Agency, and it's an arm of the AU, so maybe through the AU, they could be able to have more heads of state engagement in some of these efforts, because with the other efforts led by the space agencies locally, you would have space agencies agree to some of these terms, and then they go back to their countries to ask for funding from the presidency. And some of those take, the whole bureaucracy in the 9 years. But when you have the African Space Agency engaging with stakeholders at the AU level, um, collaborating with the space agencies at national level. I think the efforts, the top-to-down efforts in terms of funding will have higher chances of being solved, but then the engagement level with the national agencies who make some of the decisions on projects or influence some of the decisions on projects and partnerships. And then you work with them at that level to be able to implement the collaboration. So in my opinion, I don't expect the African Space Agency to build a lot of infrastructure on working on satellites and projects. That is where the level of funding you require might be slightly way higher, probably not sustainable to source locally. But I would expect the African Space Agency to galvanize the policy framework, engage the stakeholders to implement that. So depending on capabilities locally. So the funding at the central will likely be minimal and will sustain the administration of the agency, but the actual funding for projects locally will continue, but then will be galvanized in such a way to meet the collective goal of the continent. And I think that's a model that could be sustainable.
Right. So to have a sense of what the level of participation or cooperation that the African countries will bring to the African Space Agency, we could look at the cooperation or the participation in other initiatives within the continent. So let's take maybe one or two and see, for example, like RASCOM. What has been the performance of RASCOM over the years, and what's the current status of RASCOM right now?
So RASCOM is a commercial effort in the way you define it. I think the funding and the establishment of RASCOM, I think, was driven at the AU level, but the actual funding and governance came from telecom organizations and development institutions, right? And I think if I'd want to speak to RASCOM as an effort, you have to look at it more from a commercial level. And RASCOM is also delivering services on the continent. The satellite is working maybe after the delay with the first launch and then the replacement satellites. And they are one of the active players providing satellite communication services on the continent. So that project is there. Whether they are more profitable than their foreign counterparts, the private companies, so I don't have insight into their books, but RASCOM is a company that will see doing business at the commercial level and funded with investment from development banks on the continent and some of that effort. So RASCOM is a slightly different model. You can say it's a public-private partnership, but a lot of that effort is still commercial.
What about the ARMC?
So the ARMC, it's where I would have expected more success, considering that the partners to the projects already have space capabilities. I think Nigeria committed to provide capability from the Nigeria SAT2 and SAT-S. South Africa was expecting to contribute to that project with the EOSAT project. And I think that now it's coming up with EOSAT launched. And last update on that project is still more like we're still here, but I would expect that the concerted effort on that project would yield more fruit because it's a question of putting together some existing resources, right? It's not like they are launching or contributing money to launch a new satellite. It's more like these are national programs and capabilities that you plan to have, but maybe we can contribute or concert the efforts. And on the ground station or the ground side of how to use some of those data, I don't know why that hasn't really kicked off. in the way we would expect, but the capability is there to concert that. So that you can attribute to some of the diplomatic effort and when some of these agreements are reached and they're made to be cited at the agency levels, then you have to convince the policymakers at the national government to take the effort. So that's we expect the ARMC project to do more, but that hasn't happened just yet.
Let me take you slightly to a different direction now. Over the years, you can say the EU, the European Union, has been the stable partner of the African Union when it comes to space. But as you're aware, there was a new partner coming into the show, that's the US. And in December, there was the US Africa Space Forum, which was one of the side events of the US Africa Leaders Summit. So narrowing down on the Space Forum, and of course, maybe the astronomy component also, the outcome of the Space Forum, did it meet your expectations?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I was surprised with the announcement from Nigeria and Rwanda. So I was expecting that at some point African players would be able to join the Artemis Accord, but I was looking forward to how measured would the relationship turn out to be, and to what level of engagement would the US be able to do on the continent to convince other partners to come on board in full. And I think I felt it was too early for Nigeria to sign the accord. That came as a surprise to me. But also I've been looking forward to what Nigeria feels it's their interest, and how signing the accord is part of that effort. So that I'm still looking forward to, because the Artemis has the Artemis programs, and the early the pioneers most committed to contributing capability to the Artemis program, and they signed to the Artemis Accord, maybe contributing a module to the lunar lander, or contributing a ground infrastructure to that. So in my analysis of that, I was asking how can African countries contribute in terms of capability, and not just on the regulatory front, in terms of capability to the effort. And that is a question that I'm still looking forward to the answer. But by the way, I think it's also great that the US government is looking to engage in the area of space in Africa. That effort has been ongoing from all other parties. You mentioned the European Union, but also I think China is a big player in Africa in space, probably one of the biggest, especially on the infrastructure side. Japan, obviously, now it's a player, helping some of the African countries, or partnering with some of the African countries to get their satellite capability. And Russia has been here in building satellite for some partners as well. But I am looking now to a way these frameworks across the board tie into the long-term goals of these foreign powers. But I think I'm more looking forward to how that ties into the long-term goals of the African and space policy and strategy. I think you did put out a very good article on that, because the expectation is that this relationship would be mutual, and the question is, how mutual can this be in the way when you're expecting African policy makers to contribute to the conversation, especially in driving some of these agendas.
If you look at the EU relationship with Africa, I mean, there are specific programs that the EU is implementing in Africa. The GMS and Africa project, which is for Earth observation, EGNOS in Africa, which is for navigation and positioning. There's ClimeDev for climate-related issues, and the IRIS-2 that is coming up for communication. Compare that to the US. Oops, sorry. Compare that with the US, where there is a lot of technology controls and technology controls and ITA and reservations about working with other countries. So what do you think will come up from the new partnership with the US?
Yeah, that is a question that I'm looking forward to the answers as well. And by the way, the EU programs are there. I think if I rephrase your question, what I would ask is what are African partners looking to get from some of the partnerships and relationships? Because there's also a lot of conversation on building SBAS capacity, navigation and augmentation capacity in Africa and some of that. I always look at space as a domain where you build or your capability has a multiplier effect, and you can't have a capability by being a mere user, right? And Africa is building some of that capability. We've seen that in South Africa, we've seen that in Egypt. By the way, I would want to talk more about Egypt and some of the developments in 2022, which I think we should pay attention to as well.
We'll come down to the country level activities very soon. Maybe.
Yeah. But then on the question of the US strategy for Africa, I would expect them to put in some efforts on technology transfer programs. We've seen Japan doing exchanges and training engineers, and some of that is growing. I think that is not talked about enough. With the way Japan has defined some strategy, and we're seeing that across institutional exchanges. And I think maybe someone can look up the data on the percentage of African space engineers that are trained over the last 5 years. How much percentage of that is in Japan or in Europe? I think those are two numbers to look out for, and maybe in China, and probably less of that in the US. So those are some of the critical numbers that we might be looking at when we look at some of this partnership at a mutual benefit level, because its space is about the know-how, is about the technology, is about the infrastructure. And I think that is what on a personal level, I expect that level of engagement with the US.
Maybe we'll talk about Russia a bit, because like you mentioned, some of the activities that Russia is doing in Africa. The EU has a formal space partnership with Africa, if we put it that way. And with the event of last month in December, you could say that the US now has a formal space partnership with Africa. The Japanese project, the satellite project, well, I don't know whether you classify that as formal, because they are majorly student projects, masters and PhD students who go to Japan to study, to build satellites, and then their national countries now kind of intervene to work with them to be for funding or whatever. The same thing with China. It appears China's support has been more about physical infrastructure, railroad, and not so much about space, apart from maybe a few contracts like building the NICOMSAT 1 and the rest. But you can still let me know your thoughts on that. And in addition, the Russia-Africa Summit is coming up July this year. I mean, just like space took us by surprise during the US Summit, is there space on the agenda in the Russia-Africa Summit coming up? And if yes, what should we expect from that summit? So
there's been space in the agenda between African partners and Russia as far back as the 2000s. Russia have had infrastructure partnership with South Africa. They have had partnerships with Angola, the Angola has acquired satellite and South Africa from Russia. And I think in recent years, we've also seen some of this conversation. I think with Uganda, yeah, I may have missed the countries, but there are also recent conversation between Russia and some African countries around space. That will continue to be part of it. And by the way, I think the US space in Africa conversation on the sideline of the summit, it's not new. I think in the Japan, Africa, and summit, space was also one of the focal points on the sidelines. And it's also the same with the China Africa summit. So I think space, I don't expect it to be different in the Russia Africa summit, right? I think these powers continue to galvanize for influence and for partnerships on the continent. I have spent more time focusing on how African powers and how relevant some of this conversation are to the African space policy and strategy, which, by the way, is a very good policy document that recognizes the critical areas of space needs on the continent. I think that is where we should put a lot of efforts into seeing how we align the interests. Because these conversations are happening across the board. US is not the only one. It's been there. I think US came later to the game, but then how do we align the African space policy and strategy to some of this?
One other organization that appears, maybe I don't know which one it is, maybe it's not popular, is BRICS. The BRICS Association, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course South Africa. One of the components in that regional bloc is space, and the BRICS summit for this year is going to be held in South Africa. I think that was last year. In recent times, Algeria and Egypt have applied to join the BRICS group, perhaps partly to participate also in their space program. What are your thoughts about BRICS and the expansion of BRICS, especially when it comes to space in Africa?
I think Africa sits in a very great position to be able to tap into various opportunities because of maybe the non-aligned position of most African countries in a lot of the global geopolitical dichotomy. So when you look at BRICS and you also look at the Arab space program and the participation of our not African countries as well in some of those blocks, I think one way you can look at it is, let's say if African companies are trying to export space, which is usually a very contested and regulated area, would they be able to tap into some of these markets by just virtue of their membership? And the answer is yes. So I feel Africa sits in a unique position where they are able to export space components to the various blocks, both the Western blocks and to BRICS and to the Arab blocks. And when you look at some of the companies in Africa that are exporting space components, up to 90% of their revenue comes from foreign exports. And I think the diplomats could possibly continue to maintain some of those relationships without conflicting interest in a way that African companies could be able to tap into those markets. It's a good place to be in. But when it gets to, I think now space will continue to become more geopolitically defined with the way the US-China relationship is moving. And then some of these relationships would continue to come under scrutiny on either this or that. And then it becomes challenging in some aspects.
Okay, let's take a closer look at the country level activities. So let's start with respect to the space agencies now. Last year, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire announced that they were going to establish their own national space agencies. Of course, there are a couple of countries that already have space agencies or have consolidated their space institutions, like Ethiopia. Um, do we see this trend continuing? What do we expect?
Yes, I think it's a good trend. The momentum for space in Africa, it's growing rapidly. Some of that effort is driven by space becoming very important in addressing some of the challenges on the continent. New space agencies, I think now you have um, up to 22 countries looking to already have a space program. That data, I think when I lost count, when I first counted, maybe around 13. Now that data, I might not even be current because of that. But that data is growing year to year. But I am usually more excited about countries that are putting in effort in developing talent and programs locally. So some of that, when you see some of these announcements about launching space programs, and you see commitments towards investing in labs and universities, I think that's a good place to start from. I think that's a good place that the skill would grow over the years. But in places also where we've seen announcement and maybe acquisition of satellites, and sometimes that help policymakers prioritize space because they're making dollar commitments. But also we've seen some instances where that has not proven to develop capability locally. So I think in ways the African countries are launching space program, that is great, but I also feel they have to define the user requirements according to their national needs and develop niche capabilities in those areas. In countries where we've seen some niche capabilities, I think they've gone on to have an industry around that niche capability, and some of those are one of the thriving industries in the developing countries.
We don't like to talk about Egypt. Egypt has been doing a lot of capacity building, so to say, across the continent, and they are also planning they're in the process of building the Egypt Space City. What more do we expect? And of course, they are hosting the African Space Agency, and I believe the building is also getting ready. What more should we expect from Egypt this year?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of political goodwill for space in Egypt. There's a lot of momentum. They are building probably around 13 buildings for space in the space city, which would host the African Space Agency. They are building the satellite manufacturing in integration and testing center,
AIT.
MAIT, and then they have other projects lined up on around that. But I think with the way Egypt is taking both a top down and bottom up, so the space agency is building capability, but they are also intentional about research universities and building capabilities. And obviously, Egypt has really good universities, and they have some of the best universities on the continent as well. So when you see that effort, and I think they have a program they recently launched for space startups in the Innovation Hub, and they are putting both government and Egyptian government support and foreign support around some of these efforts. So I think Egypt is one of the countries you have to look out for and how some of these programs turn up over the next maybe 5 years from now and down to 10 years, because when you are building these capabilities, you need talent, you need funding, you need policies to sustain them. And what happens initially is when you develop the policies, the talent and the funding multiply on itself. So when you train a PhD students in engineering and satellites in Egypt, they either go on to work for a company, or they develop a company, because there are not many companies in the capability or in the sector. They start building companies from the universities, and somehow the research labs in the universities spin off some of these companies, right? And they get funded. And some of these companies may be acquired, and some of the funders go on to build another company. And that's how some of these efforts continue to grow. Even later in the future, when the government in power is not as excited as the current government, but you see that the roots they're already built will find way to survive, and in some instances thrive, right? I think it's a similar model we saw in South Africa with the first satellite program. And then some of this capability built within the university started to spin out to become what we know today as some of the companies in South Africa, some of the companies that are manufacturing components for the global value chain. And a lot of them started in the university, and I think it's a model that we should look out for. But Egypt is doing both models, so they are building at the research institution level, and the space agency is also building capability in manufacturing some of these components. And I think that's what you do when you have enormous political goodwill, right? But when you don't have so much political goodwill and funding, the more you already have, you can galvanize for capabilities at the universities and research and startup level.
Let's talk about South Africa. Last year, the Space Weather Center, 24-hour Space Weather Center was launched. South Africa also signed space operations agreement with the US and UAE for monitoring of their space missions. And like we said earlier, they also commenced construction of the SKA. But they still have an issue with appointing a substantive CEO for the South African National Space Agency. So what do you think could come up in South Africa this year?
Yeah, I think South Africa at the long term can continue to deal with the governance structure, or I wanted to say maybe can continue to do with the politics of or the bureaucracy of appointing management. But I think what I am looking at in South Africa is how the space infrastructure funding would enable the next growth or the next wave of startups in the country. Because now that the SKA, I think, because previous astronomy projects in South Africa kind of ushered in a wave of companies that have capability in developing some of those instruments, and some of them have gone on to be multi-million-dollar companies. I think we even saw AZIT in the millions as well, into 50 millions as way back as 10 years ago. But now that with the new infrastructure funding, the expectation is that this will usher in a new wave of startups, right? And when you look at that, it's also something to be excited about. So it depends on how the new administration in SANSA would handle the project. But I also think the South African commercial sector, it's now formidable that they could help drive some of the conversation.
Do you have any idea of the current status of the space infrastructure hub?
So there are existing startups in South Africa that will tap into that. I think what they are looking at is that the funding for the space infrastructure hub, a significant percentage of that must be spent locally. So that's a requirement in the funding for the project. I've forgotten the percentage, somewhere around 80% or 60%, but it's a significant number. And they have in good number of companies locally to start with. And I think from there you would expect more spin-offs. And by the way, I think the EOSat one satellite that was recently launched by SpaceX. I think it's a concerted effort from companies locally, and that has been on the way. So if you read the projects, you will see a long list of companies locally that have contributed to that effort.
Yeah. So there was a few satellite launches, small satellite launches last year, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Do we expect anything similar to that this year?
Yes, there are other programs that continue to support some of that effort. I think the BEDS program, the BEDS projects, and other projects that are spinning off across the continent. Some of those, I think most of them led by research institutions. So it's a trend that we should expect to continue. It's definitely a trend. And by the way, I think Djibouti is also planning to launch 2 satellites. Some of those have been announced with tentative dates, and I think it's out there.
The satellite that Djibouti is planning to launch, is it planned to launch it from the spaceport which they just signed an agreement to build, or what's the plan?
No, I think that came before the MOU for the spaceports. So the MOU for the spaceports it's a recent development. So we'll see how that goes. So someone said Botswana is planning. Yeah, there are other countries across the continent that Egypt is also planning to launch another satellite. So it's a long list. I didn't want to mention all names because it's a long list.
Okay, let's talk about the budgets in terms of spendings. You gave a sense of what happened last year. Any ideas what to expect this year in terms of budget and spendings for space?
I think the budget will grow. If you ask me, I would say it will go from 2 fronts. It will grow from the companies that are launching projects already, doubling down on space, the South Africa, the Egypt, Nigeria, and that will continue to grow. I think now that Nigeria signed the Artemis Accord, perhaps they have some projects in the works as well that I expect that maybe we can hear some of that effort, because Nigeria has a very ambitious space plan, which would expect at any point the political goodwill would drive that. And Nigeria is also expecting a change of government in 2023. So some of that are developments you might look out for. But on budgeting, I think these other new countries that are coming up to launch space programs, some will double down and increase their budgets. Botswana, Uganda, Djibouti. So I think that net will continue to expand, and maybe we can get to see a multi-billion-dollar annual budget for space in Africa within the next 5 years.
There's one aspect which I want us to conclude on, and that is some of the meetings that are coming up this year. Some of these meetings are very critical. And for example, the WRC 2023, which happens once every 4 years. If you check the program, there's quite a lot of issues to be discussed. That's why they take as long as 1 whole month in trying to reach agreements and consensus. We can't go through all those issues now, but generally, what should we expect from WRC 2023?
I think you're referring to the
World Radio Communication Conference.
Radio Communication Conference.
Yeah.
I think 5G and perhaps 6G will take a center stage, and the conversations around clearing spectrum for 5G would be critical in that conversation, especially the mid-band and spectrums. We've continued to see some of that efforts where regulators require satellite operators to clear the mid-band and spectrum for 5G deployments. I think the conversation for African countries will continue to look out for some of the spectrum conversations that will come up. There's a section of the industry that wants more spectrum, and then there's a section of the industry that wants less spectrum. So I think spectrum will definitely take the center stage, as it usually is the case in every World Radio conference.
Due to the impact of satellite constellations that are being launched impact on astronomy, do you think, regulatory issues for satellite constellations will come up during the WLC?
Yeah, I think I'm not usually the policy guy that follows the WLC, but for sure the issue of constellations and orbital slots, those are usually part of the conversation at WLC.
One other very important meeting is the open-ended working group that is trying to discuss responsible behaviors in space, development of norms in space. I think there were 2 meetings last year. Maybe there'll be 2 meetings or 3 meetings this year. What is Africa bringing to that OEGW meeting?
I think that's whole discussion on resources and sustainability in space. Africa has been instrumental in some of those at the UN corpus level. And it's my expectation that they would continue to play an active role in the discussions. So when you talk about, across the board in Africa, the expectation is that space would continue to remain demilitarized, and the resources in space would be available for all of mankind. That's the conversation now is evolving with the demand or the expectation that commercial players who mine resources in space and will be able to lay claim to resources taken out of place, right? I think the way the policy is written, but now that the Outer Space Treaty seems vague to cover commercial activities, so the expectation is that African countries would be able to continue to demand that space would maintain that stands on being a resource for all mankind. And I think that's also in some faction where I've seen some critics of the Artemis Accord say that that is conflicting with African position on the use of outer space. So I think Mem, Onwudiwe and Kwame Newton put out a research, and I think the only consign on the 10 points of the Artemis Accord is the space resources point, where they noted that there isn't any commitment to require the resources mined by commercial players to be available for all mankind. But I think these are questions. I'm not stating any opinion of my or of my employers. I'm stating that these are conversations and questions that are raised from various voices on the continent, and of course by scholars who also have written papers around that.
Yeah, and of course, the Africa is also going to participate in the CUPUS meetings coming up in February, March, and June. Okay, maybe just one last question. At the end of 2023, when you look back, what do you, in terms of evaluation, your expectations, what would you be happy that, yes, these were my expectations and these were met? So if you throw your mind to the end of 2023, what do you want to look back and see that would have happened in Africa?
So my expectation would be that we have an update on the African Space Agency and on for the way forward and how the agency would be funded and a lot of the projects. So my expectation also is that more African universities will continue to invest in laboratory research on space and astronomy. So my expectation is that particularly in Nigeria, that a new government will be able to put in some policy drafts on the way forward for space. So when you have a new government in Nigeria, and I would expect some directions on the Nigeria's ambitious space plan. By the way, Nigeria had a plan to land an astronaut on the moon by 2030 on a Nigerian-built rocket. And I think it's a very ambitious space program, but the foundation of that program was built on building capability in-house. And that we'll continue to expect that at some point there would be a renaissance in how that is being achieved. So my expectation is that by 2023, a new government in Nigeria could be able to visit the Nigerian space program and not just put out new policy, but actually draw a plan on implementation and across the board. I believe by now you must have known that my expectation for the African space program is that we'll continue to build capability in niche areas that we have advantage. We'll continue to build talents in ways that align with the broader space programs, and we'll continue to invest in local capabilities, because at the end of the day, that is a benefit that could trickle into other areas of science and technology.
Mr. Joseph Ibe, thank you for speaking to us on Policy Talks.
Great, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.